All right, it is 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, welcome to the OASIS Plus DPA training. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wynn, and I'm the Customer Branch Chief for the Stakeholder Engagement Division within PSHC. For the training today, you will receive 1.5 CLPs for this session, and warranted contracting officers can submit their requests for DPAs. We will be providing more information on the instructions for the submittal during this presentation. Also, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A pod throughout the training, as we'll be monitoring this throughout the entire presentation. The presenter for today is Brian Booth, who is a professional services advisor also within the customer branch. In his role, Brian serves as a subject matter expert for all PSHC contracting solutions and assists customer agencies by completing scope reviews, answering any questions, providing recommendations for contracting vehicles, doing training like he is today, and so much more. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian.
All right, thanks, Rachel, and thank you everybody who joined us today. It is obviously the very first day of the new fiscal year, so hopefully you weren't up too late yesterday plugging away those last minute contract awards for the last fiscal year. It's also officially October 1st, which means it's the month of Halloween. So I'm glad to see that we have some participants in today's training, and I wasn't totally ghosted. There's your Halloween pun for the day. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. As Rachel mentioned, today's DPA training is worth 1.5 CLPs, and it'll take just about an hour and a half. So we'll get right into it. As Rachel also mentioned, we do have the Q&A pod available, so if you have any questions, please put them in there. We have some wonderful folks behind the scenes helping answer those questions, like Sheila Morrison and Brittany Black and Tony Checky, etc. So I'll put them in there, and if there are some important ones that we need to answer live, we can take a break, hopefully sometime during the presentation, and do that, or hopefully we'll have time at the end as well. Along with that, a copy of the presentation will be sent out after this training, and you should be receiving your CLP, I believe, within 7 to 10 business days. But Tim would correct me, hopefully, if I'm wrong on that one. But you're here to learn about OASIS Plus, and here's what we're going to cover today. So first of all, we've done some welcomes, and welcome to you as well for being here. We'll cover what OASIS Plus is. We'll cover the roles and responsibilities, both of GSA and the ordering activities. We'll cover how you build your OASIS task order, from defining the requirements and the scope of the requirements, from selecting the IDIQ contracts, the domains, and the NAICS codes. We'll also talk about the contract access fee and the task order solicitation system, and how you actually put out those solicitations or RFPs for OASIS Plus orders through GSA eBuy. And then we'll leave you with some additional resources at the very end to quite a few different online tools and online guides, as well as other samples and templates that you can take away and use for ordering when you're looking at using OASIS Plus. So a couple things, as I think Rachel mentioned some of these as well. We're using zoom.gov or ZoomGov, so hopefully you're already familiar with that platform. But if you're not, like we mentioned, there is a Q&A pod. We do have the chat disabled for attendees, because normally the levels of attendees for these classes is very high, and that can get quite distracting and convoluted when you have the chat box open. Likewise, everyone is muted for this, and cameras are off, because we do have a lot of content to cover. But as I mentioned, please do ask your questions, and we'll hopefully answer those during today's event. And the slides will be distributed after this event as well. If you have any issues with getting your CLPs, as I mentioned, you should be receiving them within 7 to 10 business days. But if there are problems with that, or if there are any questions about the DPA training itself, you can always email oasisplusdpa@gsa.gov, and we will get back to you as soon as we can with that. Your CLPs will not automatically be loaded, though, into FAI CSOD, so you'll probably have to submit an external continuous learning activity request once you receive your certificate of completion. So the objectives today, here's what I hope you will take away, besides a bad pun about Halloween. First of all, we want you to understand what your role is in terms of being part of the ordering activity, whether you're the OCO, perhaps a contract specialist, or even a program manager or someone associated with that. in terms of using the OASIS Plus program. You should also understand what our role is. What do we do as far as awarding and administering these contracts? We really want you to get a better understanding of the scope of the contract program itself. It's very, very large. It's very complex. So it is kind of important to know which areas of this contract program might be best for the mission that you're dealing with your particular agency or a particular requirement. I want you to be able to walk away from today's training with an understanding of the framework of how to actually use the OASIS Plus contract program to get to a solution for your requirements. That means selecting the contracts, the domains, and the NAICS codes. Also, what do you do with the fee? First of all, what is it? How much do I actually have to pay to use this program? And then how do I incorporate that into individual task orders? And then lastly, hopefully you'll get a better idea of the task ordering, or excuse me, the task order solicitation management system, which is GSA eBuy. We aren't going to go into a bunch of details about that, first of all, because it's not fully completed in the eBuy system. The contracts haven't been quite awarded yet and not incorporated into that system. But there is separate training available on the use of GSA eBuy that you can also take. There's lots of job aids that we'll be able to provide as well for understanding how you actually get into that and the nuts and bolts of that system. But today we'll just cover that at a high level. So first of all, what is OASIS Plus? OASIS is an acronym, of course. We love our acronyms. We're the government. OASIS stands for One Acquisition Solution for Integrated Services. Now, this is a successor contract program to the original OASIS program, so it includes an expansion of scope and quite a few different changes from that legacy program. So therefore, we added on a plus because it's not just the old OASIS anymore. There's a whole lot more, so OASIS Plus. I know it's very innovative. But OASIS Plus, like OASIS, is a government-wide contract that hopefully meets federal agencies' mission needs for a full range of services requirements, and the emphasis there on services. Another emphasis too for integrated services. It's not just for one particular type of service in most cases. It's for more than one type of service rolled into one requirement. There is one exception to that. This is not for IT services principally. So if you do have a requirement that is for principal purpose IT services, and there are other solutions out there. OASIS Plus, as you can see in this graphic, is made up of 6 distinct IDIQ contracts. There are 5 of those that are set aside for small businesses. One of them is for total small business. That means any company that qualifies as a small business and qualifies for this contract program can participate there. And then there are 4 other socioeconomic set-asides, including 8A small business, hub zone, service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, and women-owned small businesses. And then lastly, there is the unrestricted contract as well under OASIS Plus, which includes primarily other than small businesses. However, some small businesses could also potentially qualify for that. So there's a lot of ways to access small business industry partners using this program. Some of the unique features that you should be aware of is that one of the intents of setting up a program like OASIS Plus was to make sure that we were able to match our agency partners with some of the most highly qualified industry partners that are out there. This means that the evaluation factors that we used and the bar that we set for agents or for industry partners to qualify was a lot higher than some of the other contract programs that you might be familiar with, including something like the Schedules program. So for instance, industry partners had to demonstrate particular knowledge and experience and capability in the industry space that they were applying for. And they had to demonstrate a fairly long list of experience. So that could be qualifying projects, both commercial and under other federal contracts. But they had to really demonstrate that they could do the work in the space that they claim that they can do. Not only that, the relevant project experience, of course, was one of the primary factors, but also other certifications such as ISO certifications, cost accounting systems, experience doing classified work, and that type of stuff went into an industry partner being able to qualify for a spot on the OASIS Plus contract. So we really wanted to make sure that we got some of the best industry partners to participate in this space. but also a lot of them small businesses. As I mentioned already, we have the 5 different small business contract programs, and we really wanted to maximize our agency partners' ability to marry up and match with small business industry partners. You'll see there are quite a few small business industry partners that are going to be awarded under this program. Another unique feature is that contract program was designed to be flexible and expandable. In fact, we already have an expansion in the works. We call it phase 2. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But there is flexibility built into this contract program as well. So if at a future time we recognize there is an overall need by the federal government for services, we could add those in addition to what's currently planned for OASIS Plus. Another unique feature is that this program doesn't have a ceiling for the entire contract program. And that means for you as ordering agencies, there's no cap on the individual awards that you issue under OASIS Plus. This also means that we won't have to curtail any periods of performance for task orders because there's a potential that it might run up against the ceiling because there is no ceiling. Like OASIS, OASIS Plus has a 10-year ordering period, which means there's a 5-year base period for those awardees, and then a 5-year option period. Now, this is going to be a little bit different because some awardees that join the OASIS Plus program may join at a later point. For them, they will still have a 5-year base period, but their option period after that will not be the full 5 years. All the contracts will have a final 10-year cutoff period for ordering, which they will not be able to go beyond. But for all of our phase 1 contractors, it'll be a base of 5 and then an option year of 5 years. Excuse me. OASIS Plus can support both commercial and non-commercial services acquisitions as well, or a hybrid of those. Remember, this is for integrated services, so perhaps part of your requirement is for commercial services. Maybe it's some HR and financial positions that are helping support a program that's for R&D work that's non-commercial, so it can include hybrids of that. A few other things, the OASIS Plus program has already been designated a best-in-class contract. So if you're familiar with the spend under management framework that federal contracts are classified under, that means OASIS Plus is a tier 3 or best in class. And all agencies have goals for achieving at least tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 contracts, or using those types of contracts in place of tier 0 contracts. And there's a sub goal for best in class contracts as well. So if you're trying to achieve those goals for best in class contract utilization, OASIS Plus will help get you there. One last thing that's a pretty unique feature about OASIS Plus is that unlike other similar IDIQ programs and unlike the legacy OASIS program, this will have continuous on-ramping after we complete our phases. So after phase 1 is complete, we've made our initial sets of awards, we will reopen the solicitation and allow for continuous on-ramping of new industry partners. This is something that we heard loud and clear from both our industry and agency partners about when we were exploring how we were going to set up this program a few years back, is that they really wanted to see an easier process for industry partners to join the program and basically inject kind of new life into it. When you have subcontractors that are doing fantastic work, but they can't get a spot as a prime contractor, it can be really frustrating from both the industry and our agency partners. So the way that OASIS Plus is organized is around what we call domains. Now, you might be familiar under other IDIQ programs that are similar. They may have pools, or they may have zones, or they may have other ways of categorizing that. OASIS Plus has what we are calling domains. Domains are organized by functional groupings of services, and those services are or should be related in most cases. So for example, we have our technical and engineering services domain, which, as you would expect, includes primarily engineering services, but it also includes other services that are usually often related to that, including testing laboratory services or mapping and surveying services. But you'll see, we'll get into the details of that, but keep in mind that these domains were organized so that you have industry partners competing with like industry partners for requirements that they are capable of actually performing in most cases. What we didn't want is we didn't want companies that perhaps provide primarily marketing and public relations services competing for engineering requirements just because they're in the same space under a contract program. In this case, if you were to issue a solicitation to the technical engineering domain, you should have engineering and technical firms that are qualified that compete for that type of work. Within each of these domains, they are organized also by NAICS codes. We'll talk about those in more detail as well. But keep in mind that is how they are defined. So NAICS codes are an important piece of how you go about doing your market research and setting up your acquisition strategy when you're considering OASIS Plus. Now, the contractors themselves can qualify for some or all of the NAICS codes in a domain. And that depends on if they met the qualifications, first of all, for the overall contract, and then the particular domain that they were applying for, and then whether or not they qualified as, if it's a small business set aside, if they qualify for small for a particular NAICS code, or if they have that NAICS code in their SAM registration as well. So you will see in some cases, some industry partners do have some NAICS awarded within a domain, but perhaps not all. That's important because that establishes what we call the fair opportunity pool. And we'll get into some detail about that as well. So as the OCO, the ordering contracting officer, it will be your job to select the IDIQ contract, the domain, and the NAICS code that represents the best scope of your requirement. And trust me, we'll talk about that some more as well. Because, as I mentioned, that fair opportunity is conducted at the NAICS code level. So that's why it's very important. The NAICS codes, I should mention, also are associated with the CLIN for the particular contract. So for each contractor, they will have a CLIN for each NAICS code that they have, or they actually are awarded in a domain. So sometimes you'll see that term used interchangeably. A couple things, though, that I want you to be aware of that OASIS Plus is not. One of the common things that I hear from folks that aren't too familiar with GSA contract programs is, hey, I've heard about that OASIS schedule or that OASIS Plus schedule. It's not a schedule. Schedules are a pretty unique thing that GSA's Federal Acquisition Service maintains. That's a different program that is under the auspices of FAR 8.4. And OASIS Plus is not a schedule under FAR 8.4. In fact, it's based off of FAR 16.505 ordering procedures. Schedules are a very unique program and a very great program for a variety of different services, but OASIS Plus is not them. So just keep that in mind. OASIS Plus also is not designed for principal purpose IT requirements, construction, or architecture and engineering contracts as well. So if you have those types of requirements, there are some other solutions out there for the IT, such as our GWACS and the Schedules program. But for construction and A&E work, that typically needs to be done under FAR 36 ordering procedures. OASIS Plus is not limited to standard labor categories, although we do have them. It's also not limited to pre-negotiated labor rates, although we do have some of those as well. Now, those can be a factor in your decision-making process for one exception, and that's for sole source or non-competitive T&M and labor hour orders. In that case, as an ordering contracting officer, you can review the negotiated ceiling rates for those standard labor categories, but that is the one exception, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. As I mentioned before, there's no ceiling on the entire contract family, so therefore there's no cap on the total value of your task order as well. So you don't have to worry about that when you're doing your acquisition planning. Another thing that it is not, OASIS Plus is not, is that it's not limited to the number of awards that we may make for a contract or for a domain. In the past, there have been a lot of programs that set perhaps a target number of awards that they would make, and then any industry partner that didn't qualify for that target number, maybe they were the 101st out of 100, they would not have gotten a spot on the contract. That is not what we are doing under OASIS Plus. As long as contractors can qualify for the particular domain and NAICS codes that they are applying, then they can get a spot under the OASIS Plus contract. We do not have target numbers or cutoff numbers. So if we wanted to take all that information and put it into one graphic at one time, this might be what it looks like. So first you have your IDIQ contracts over here, all 6 of those. Those are the 5 small business ones in light gray and then unrestricted in dark gray. And then you've got those first phase of domains that I mentioned up top here, crossing all of these ones. And you can see that the initial contract awards, we are rolling them out. We actually did make some. I don't know if I'm supposed to announce that or not, but there were some made yesterday prior to the end of the fiscal year. And we're going to continue that process into Q1 of fiscal year 25. And then, as I mentioned, we will reopen the solicitation on a continuous basis starting in this fiscal year. Give us a little bit of time, but it will happen this fiscal year. So that's phase one. Now you'll notice there's also a color scheme that goes with each of these domains, and that color scheme is related to whether or not these services were previously covered by different contract programs. So for me, it's dark blue, but these first 4 columns in dark blue represent services that were previously commonly awarded under the OASIS program. OASIS was a best-in-class contract, by the way. The light blue, at least for me, it's light blue, that's facilities services. That was previously covered by the BMO IDIQ contract program. That's building, maintenance, and operations, which was also big. Now, you won't see any of the dark blue or whatever the darker color is, HCATs, quite yet, because that's going to be part of phase 2. And if I have there it is, yeah. Phase 2 rolls in here. You'll see that the scope of human capital services will be included at a later date, which we'll start working on as well in this fiscal year. That's because the HCATS program still has a bit of life left in it. In fact, the ordering period for HCATS won't wrap up until FY26. So orders can still be placed on there for another 1.5 years or up to almost 2 years. So there's still good runway to use the HCATS program. So that's why we're not including it until phase 2. And then there's the orange columns. Those are what we call expanded scope. So today, a lot of these services are being awarded under things like the Legacy OASIS program or through the Schedules program. But in some cases, we didn't have a real definite way of organizing this work. We've tried to correct for that and build these new domains centered around services that match up with mission spaces that are in intelligence services, environmental services, and then some things that we call like the enterprise solutions, which is for high complex work, and we'll talk about that in a lot of more detail. But you'll also see in phase 2, we're going to continue to add some new domains and existing work that can be done today, such as financial services, marketing and PR services, et cetera. So that's all of that in one giant graphic. Hopefully it's not too confusing, but this is basically the framework of OASIS Plus and how it's set up and how it's going to be set up going forward in the future. I should mention the timeline. I did it already for phase 1, the open continuous in FY25, and then phase 2, as I mentioned, we're going to start working on that in FY25, and we hope that we can start making those actual awards perhaps near the end of FY25 or into early FY26. Okay, so roles and responsibilities. Now, if you really want to get into all the details of the specific roles and responsibilities, or if we don't cover it in this part of the training today, you can always refer back to the actual OASIS Plus contracts under section G.2.2.1, or the OASIS Plus ordering guide under section 2.7, and that's online. You can take a look at it anytime. And there is a link right there for it as well. So that does have the reference material. If you're confused about what you're supposed to be doing as an OCO versus what we're supposed to be doing as the GSA COs that administer these contracts. But on the top level, GSA awards, administers, and manages the OASIS Plus contracts as IDIQs. Obviously, we're not doing your task orders for you unless it's a different part of GSA. That would be perhaps the assisted acquisition service. But at the top level, we manage all the IDIQ work. That also includes maintaining the open continuous solicitation, updating it when necessary, accepting new proposals, evaluating those proposals, selecting awardees if they actually do deserve an award for them. So that's going to be an ongoing process for us. And of course, as changes are made with laws or regulations, we'll implement those changes at the IDIQ level. As the ordering activity, it's your job to make sure that you're soliciting your requirement through the OASIS Plus Fair Opportunity process, or use an exception and follow the rules about using an exception at the task order level. It's also going to be your job to evaluate, award, report, and administer, and manage, and close out those OASIS Plus task orders. So there is a bit of work you have to do at the task order level as well. If we go into a bit more detail of what that means, Here are some of the key responsibilities that GSA is responsible for. We will be monitoring contract performance at the IDIQ level, but as you can imagine, there's not a lot of contractor performance that we'll have to monitor because the actual work that they're going to be doing is going to be at the task order level. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't take any action, or we won't take any action, of course. If we hear there are issues with contractor performance that have to be addressed at an IDIQ level, then we'll take those necessary steps to do so. Or if we are aware of that ourselves, then we can take those steps. But we will continue to monitor and evaluate at the IDIQ level. We also hold exclusive non-delegable rights to modify those master contract terms and conditions. Once we do that, then those terms and conditions also then will flow down to any subsequent task orders, in most cases, unless there's some fill-in information. But it won't necessarily change any existing task orders that were issued before those terms and conditions were modified. So for task orders that you're already responsible for, you would have to make those changes yourself. But we'll make the necessary changes at the IDIQ level, making it easier for future task order issuance, so they don't have to then go back and make their own changes. We also negotiate, establish, and manage the small business subcontracting plans at the IDIQ level. Now, this applies to other than small businesses, of course, not to small businesses. And if you recall, subcontracting plans can only be applied to one contract. Since we are doing that at the IDIQ level, you cannot have a subcontracting plan at the task order level. What you can do is, if you want, you can set small business subcontracting goals for your other than small business contractors at the task order level. But keep in mind, you are responsible for then managing those goals and whether or not your contractor meets those goals. Another of our responsibilities is to make sure that we continue to provide advice and guidance and training to any of our agency partners that are using these contract programs. So we'll continue to provide training like this or similar training about the systems that are involved with OASIS Plus. We'll have meetings. We can definitely schedule meetings one-on-one with agencies or acquisition teams if they have questions. We're answering questions daily about our contract programs, technical questions about what do I do next, or how do I find this type of information. And we'll continue to do that, of course, through the entire life of the OASIS Plus program. It's also our job to issue delegations of procurement authority to ordering contracting officers. That means we have to provide the training, keep the content of the training updated, keep the content of the ordering guides updated, and then managing and issuing those delegations as well. We'll conduct meetings with our OASIS Plus contractors, whether it's performance related or if it's just to provide information back to them about changes in the OASIS Plus program overall. So if we need to, have more one-on-one meetings with contractors, we can definitely do that. But we also have very frequent meetings with them as a whole to make sure that they understand any updates and changes in the programs. Well, we have done EEO clearances also at the IDIQ level, so they are not typically required at the task order level, but your agency may have a separate policy on that depending. And lastly, it's our responsibility to also maintain the spend under management best-in-class designation for these contracts. I believe that has to be updated every single year. So we have to make sure that we've met any reporting requirements, and those reporting requirements also can change. So those are some of the key responsibilities that we handle on our side of it. As the ordering activity, some of the key responsibilities that you have are, first of all, if you are going to be the contracting officer, make sure you have your DPA. That's probably why you're attending today if you are a CO. Make sure you have the DPA, you understand the responsibilities that go along with that, and understand how to actually create solicitations for OASIS Plus and how to manage that process. As an ordering activity, it's also your job to issue requests for information and the request for proposals and use the proper task order solicitation management system, which is eBuy. But we have some tools to help you along that path, especially in the market research stage. A couple things that we can help out with is, first of all, providing scope reviews to help ensure that your requirement actually is going to be a good fit for OASIS Plus. My team handles a lot of those, and we'll continue to handle those for OASIS Plus as well. Another thing is providing market research support through our market research as a service program. If you haven't heard of it before, it's a fantastic way to issue an RFI, basically. But it's a nice format that our industry partners are used to and seem to be more responsive to than your general RFIs that come out through maybe SAM.gov. It's also your job as the ordering activity to ensure that the task order itself complies with the terms and conditions of the IDIQ contract. As I said, those, for the most part, flow down to the task order level, but you got to make sure that you're not inserting any conflicting language at the task order level that might conflict with the IDIQ terms and conditions. You also have to make sure that the procedures that you're using are the procedures that are outlined for OASIS Plus, and those are outlined in the ordering guide and the contracts themselves. You'll have to make sure also, of course, that if you have any agency regulatory supplements, statutes, or policies that apply to task orders that are issued under FAR 16505, that you include those at the task order level. We can't do that for you because we don't know what your particular agency statutes and policies might be. So if you have those, make sure to include those as well. And as I mentioned before, while we can modify the IDIQ contracts and make those changes, which will flow down to future task orders, they will not retroactively, in most cases, apply to task orders. So if there are changes that happen, you have existing task orders, then you'll have to make sure and do that yourself. A few other things that you are responsible for is determining pricing fair and reasonable at the task order level. As I mentioned, there's only one instance where the actual negotiating ceiling rates for the IDIQs comes into play, and that's for those T&M or labor hour sole source orders. Typically, though, your job will be to determine the pricing fair and reasonable at the task order level, and then, of course, appropriately document that. Another thing that you will have to keep in mind during your acquisition planning, of course, is reviewing mandatory sources. Keep in mind, Ability One provides some mandatory services, and you'll want to make sure and double check to ensure that, is using OASIS Plus the right thing, or should I be using a mandatory source like Ability One? It's also your job as the ordering activity to identify the proper contract domain and NAICS code or CLIN, identify whether or not your requirement is a commercial or non-commercial service, or maybe it's a hybrid. Identify the contract type that you're going to use in your particular task order, whether or not that's going to be fixed price, cost type, or a hybrid of any of those. Also identify any of those terms, conditions, clauses, and provisions that are applicable to the task order itself that your agency might require you to include. Or if it's fill-in language, such as the exercise of options or a possible extension, that does not automatically flow down from the IDIQ because that's particularly applies to your task order. And then also, if you have a need for an approved accounting system, because you're going to be issuing something like a cost type task order, you'll need to ensure that the contractors do have an approved accounting system. That is not a requirement to have one of those to qualify for an OASIS Plus contract. So do keep it in mind for cost type orders. If you have to have a contractor with an approved accounting system, you'll want to ensure that's the case. The same with cost accounting standards. If you have to apply certain cost accounting standards to a task order, then you'll need to make sure that the contractor is actually meeting those certifications for cost accounting standards. A few other things that you're also responsible for. This top one is the one that we used to be responsible for, but there has been a change in that, and that is limitations on subcontracting for small businesses and socioeconomic small business awards. So if you're setting aside work for any of those, then you need to ensure that if they are going to be utilizing subcontractors, that they aren't exceeding those subcontractor thresholds of more than 49%, if they're going to be using other than small businesses, or if they are going to be using small businesses and they don't want to exceed that those are similarly situated small business concerns for subcontracting. So that is your responsibility now at the task order level. Along with that, the task order is yours from cradle to grave. We don't issue task orders on, the OASIS Plus program does not issue task orders on an agency's behalf. Now, GSA can do that through the Assisted Acquisition Service, but the PSHC and OASIS Plus programs do not. It's also your job to allow a reasonable time for fair opportunity proposal submission. Now, reasonable can vary depending quite a bit on the requirement and the specifics of that. But make sure you give industries partners a reasonable time to actually put together a decent proposal so that you actually get quality proposals back. You don't want something that was done very hastily. Of course, there might be some FOIA requests. There might be congressional inquiries, IG inquiries, or SBA, or even GAO inquiries that are at the task order level. For those types of inquiries, it is your responsibility to respond to those. We will help as much as we possibly can. However, oftentimes we're limited to the information that's available at the IDIQ level because some of those inquiries are very specific to a particular task order or requirement. So we'll provide as much help and support as we can for those types, but it's oftentimes the order and activities responsibility to respond directly to those. For congressional notifications in particular, we have notified Congress, of course, about the OASIS Plus program at the IDIQ level, but oftentimes congressional notifications are asked for at the task order level. So you'll need to follow your own agency policies and regulations for those in terms of a particular task order size or value and whether or not you need to send out a notification. Lastly, monitoring contractor performance. This is where this is the most important place where contractor performance should be measured, and that's at the task order level. Did they meet the objectives of the requirement? Did they do a good job in doing that? Were there issues with how they performed or how they managed the performance of a requirement or a program? That's the type of contractor performance assessment that needs to be done at the task order level, and it's probably the most valuable, both back to the contractor and to other agencies that are evaluating contractors and whether or not they could do a good job for a particular requirement. So make sure to monitor and report on contractor performance for the entire life of the task order, not just the first year. It's for the entire task order. So just in case you were wondering some of the rules behind all of this, and why agencies can use OASIS Plus in the first place, it's because orders issued against an IDIQ like OASIS Plus are considered interagency acquisitions, which normally fall under FAR 17.5 rules. Now, GSA has specific statutory authority under the USC 4501, as you can see there, to buy either supplies or non-personal services on the behalf of other agencies. That means we can establish contracts like OASIS Plus, and then allow agencies to directly order from those contracts. Or, as I've mentioned in the past, we can do the contracting and acquisition work on an agency's behalf through our assisted acquisition service. But GSA does have some unique authority to do that. Because of that unique authority, the Economy Act does not apply as defined under 17.502-2. Which means you don't have to do a separate determination and findings to use GSA, whether that's through the AAS, the Assisted Acquisition Services, or if you're going to use our contract programs like OASIS Plus to do direct orders. So you don't have to do that. It saves you a really nice step instead of having to do a DNF for that. A couple other things that you should know about FAR 16505 ordering in general and why contract programs like OASIS Plus are often a benefit to agencies in terms of especially time and resources, is because if you're looking at placing task orders under 16505, it can save you a significant amount of time compared to doing open market acquisitions, typically done under something like FAR 15. A few reasons why that is, or a few key things you should keep in mind with FAR 16505. There actually is not a solicitation threshold limit under 16505. For OASIS Plus, though, we do recommend that the minimum order be at least the simplified acquisition threshold, which today, of course, is $250,000. The reason why we recommend that is, first of all, orders under that, oftentimes we don't see competition, sometimes zero responses, because OASIS contractors, and I imagine OASIS Plus contractors, are typically used to doing larger requirements for integrated services and complex type of work. And those requirements typically aren't that small. For smaller service requirements like that, oftentimes things like the schedules program would be a fantastic fit as long as it's commercial. There isn't a defined solicitation period. However, as I mentioned earlier, it is the OCO's responsibility to give a reasonable amount of time for proposals to be developed and then accepted back. Now, your agency policy may differ from that. I know that if you're DoD and you're only expecting to get one offer, then you have to have it out there for at least 30 days. And sometimes that makes the most sense. But as long as it's reasonable, that's what's the key here for the solicitation period. There's no minimum. No synopsis is required unless you're doing a limited sources exception to fair opportunity under 16505 Part A. So you don't have to worry about synopsizing the requirements. You don't have to have a formal source selection evaluation board as you would if you were doing something under FAR 15. However, there are a lot of times that you have complex requirements that you might want a formal SSEB, and that's totally fine as well. You evaluate how it makes the most sense and do your source selection to what makes the most sense for your organization and a particular requirement. You're not required to set a competitive range, and if you do set a competitive range, you're not required to conduct formal discussions as you would under FAR 15. But you can still negotiate with industry partners under FAR 16.5. One thing I would caution agencies on is that if you're going to do that, you just want to make sure and be clear and not use confusing language where it might seem that the acquisition is being done under FAR 15 ordering procedures. So do make sure to draw the line between that if you are going to do negotiations under FAR 16.5. The source selection itself, as I mentioned, you have a lot of leeway. In fact, it says the ordering agency has broad discretion in setting up the ordering procedures under FAR 16.505. So you're not limited to particular ways of selecting awardees for task orders. And that brings me to the next point, that you are issuing task orders under FAR 16.505. That's it. You don't have to use something like the uniform contract format as you would under FAR 15. We have sample task order templates if that's something you want. They're pretty basic, but they'll get the job done. And you can access other examples out there as well through some of the other resources. Another key point about FAR 16.505 is that protests are not allowed in the case of a GSA contract for any order that is below $10 million, unless that order increases the scope, the period of performance, or the maximum value of the contract. So that's why scope reviews are very helpful. You want to make sure that your requirement is within scope. But if it's less than 10 million and it's in scope, and it's not outside the period of the ordering period or period of performance, then it cannot be protested if it's less than 10 million. Protests can only be filed with the GAO under FAR 16.505 ordering procedures. So that means no agency protests, no COFC protests. There is one exception to that 10 million limitation. That's if it's a small business size status protest. That needs to be done in accordance with FAR 19.302. Post-award, what do you have to do if you're using 16.505? You do have to issue notifications. This is for orders over 6 million. You have to issue notifications. That is according to FAR 15 order procedures, and debriefings if they're requested under FAR 15.506. So you do have to do a few things. You don't have to do pre-award debriefings because this is not FAR 15 in that respect, but there are some aspects of post-award notifications and debriefings that you have to take into consideration. The very last thing I want to mention is that, and we get this question quite a bit, and this is why I like to highlight it, is blanket purchase agreements. Blanket purchase agreements are an IDIQ-like instrument, and there have been a couple of cases that have determined that IDIQs or IDIQ-like instruments cannot be issued against existing IDIQs. OASIS Plus is an IDIQ, therefore you cannot issue a blanket purchase agreement or another IDIQ against it. There are a lot of flexibilities available under programs like OASIS Plus, including that flexibility of contract types. You could have a hybrid, like I said, of fixed price and T&M and cost type contracting that you could, and optional CLINs that you could include in your requirement, but you cannot issue a BPA or an IDIQ. Okay, let's talk about selecting the appropriate parameters. So now that you have some of the regulatory backgrounds, how do you actually select the parameters under OASIS Plus? So first of all, let's take a look at what your requirement might look like and how do you look at the scope of your requirement. Now this is a pretty convoluted graphic, but bear with me. This is an example from NASA of a project lifecycle table that they would use, or a chart that kind of shows how some of their projects might go. So they have, their pre-phase A, which is concept studies, then concept and technology development under phase A, then prelim design and technology completion under phase B, design and fabrication under phase C, and on and on. These projects can span years, maybe decades. And this can be applied to all sorts of other agencies too that have large programs or projects that might span these huge life cycles. So when we talk about acquisition in this respect, we're talking about the big A type of acquisition, not the acquisition of an individual contract or an individual task order. These life cycles, obviously from beginning to end, if they have a beginning and end, oftentimes involve any of these aspects, including, first of all, analyzing the requirements. Let's say a new law gets passed or a new branch of an agency gets set up. What is their mission? What do they need to do to accomplish the objectives and tasks they've been assigned per this new law? So there's a requirement analysis that happens. What do we need to do to be successful? Concept developments. Once we understand what our objectives are, how do we get there? Now let's talk about the specific concepts of what will make it work. And then planning and acquisition. Once you have the concepts down, let's actually acquire the things that we need to do this next. And then once things are going, then you want to test and evaluate, make sure that they're going correctly. Are things working the way they're supposed to do? And on throughout the entire life of a project until closeout and disposal. Once this weapon system has finally met the end of its life expectancy, or once this technology is now obsolete, what do we need to do to close this out, dispose of these things? Or once a particular program no longer has any usefulness, maybe it's a treasury program for something that doesn't exist anymore. How do we close those programs out? So at any point in the life cycle, you'll probably need some sort of contract services to help support you. And that's what a program like OASIS Plus is designed to do. And so that the domains, hopefully, as you'll see over there, will somehow line up depending on where you're at in this life cycle. Now, the NASA example, most of this is going to be probably a bit more hands-on work, maybe in the tech and engineering field or R&D fields. But for some other agencies, it might be more management and advisory work during the entire phase of this program or during certain points of the program. To look at where are we at, how are we doing today? Or maybe it's really, I'm going to need contract support throughout this entire thing to make sure that we're always staying on target, on check. Are we getting to the endpoints that we want to? So that's kind of an example of looking at your own requirement, determining where it's at in terms of life cycle, and then figuring out the scope of work that's actually needed. In some cases, it might be easy to identify. So for a NASA program like this, if you're in the system assembly, integration, and test and launch and checkout phase D, what you probably need is actual engineers doing engineering work from a contractor. That's very much more tangible. You might go straight to the tech and engineering domain. But other things such as that behind the scenes kind of work, maybe financial contract support work to make sure that invoices from all the different contractors are being managed properly, that budgets are being allocated properly. That might be behind the scenes, kind of a more of a management advisory role that continues on throughout this entire life cycle. So understanding the type of work that the contractor is going to be providing and where it fits into the life cycle can be important in defining your own requirement scope. The reason why that's important to keep in mind is because at some point, you're going to have to determine the principal purpose NAICS code for the task order that you're going to issue under OASIS Plus. That NAICS code is very important, as I've already mentioned before. Now, you could have ancillary work that goes along with that. Let's say you need those engineers doing engineering work, but along with that, you have an IT system that needs to be supported so that it can take all the engineering data and crunch it and then spit out reports. And so you need IT support work as well. Maybe you also need some actual SCLS work for drivers of equipment or mechanics for actual equipment. Those are all ancillary types of labor that can be included in your task order. So it doesn't necessarily restrict the scope. You'll just want to make sure that they are truly ancillary and not the principal purpose. In terms of whether or not your requirement is commercial or non-commercial, once again, that's not a limiting factor. As I've already mentioned, OASIS Plus can be used for any of that or a hybrid. The same for classified work. Now, some contract programs do not allow for classified work. OASIS Plus does allow for it. Now, you'll have to take your own steps and precautions, of course, when you're dealing with classified information and who can be privy to it, but you can still do that work under OASIS Plus as well. And lastly, where the work is performed is not a limiting factor for OASIS Plus. It can be done anywhere in the world, both CONUS and OCONUS. So the scope of those things, if that's part of your requirement or a concern, typically it's not going to be a big deal under OASIS Plus. Some things that are a big deal though, which may push your requirement out of scope are if the requirement is for inherently governmental functions, as defined under FAR 2.101. Likewise, if it's for personal services under FAR 2.101, that would make it out of scope of OASIS Plus. If you recall, GSA has unique authority, but it's only for non-personal services, not for personal services. As I mentioned before, if the principal purpose is for IT services, that's typically out of scope of OASIS Plus. However, there is one exception to that, and that is for a national security system. A national security system is either a telecommunications or information system that's operated by the federal government, the function, operation, or use of which involves intelligence activities, cryptologic activities related to national security, or command and control of military forces, or equipment that is an integral part of a weapon or weapon systems and is critical to the direct fulfillment of military or intelligence missions. Now, this does not include systems that are used for pretty routine administrative and business applications like payroll systems, finance systems, logistics systems like inventory systems, that kind of stuff. That stuff does not meet the exception. But if you have a requirement that does meet that exception for national security systems, then it's not really considered IT, and it could possibly be done under something like OASIS Plus. We don't see a lot of those, and I caution people about trying to, if they're trying to fit their requirement, if it's a square requirement into a round hole, maybe it's not really a national security system. You should be using an IT contract program, but there is an exception out there. It exists. Also, as I mentioned earlier, if your requirement truly is for construction or A&E work, that is outside the scope of OASIS Plus. So if the scope of your requirement is that, it's not within the scope of OASIS Plus. Lastly, the NAICS code. And I know I've mentioned this several times, but I'll mention it again. If the NAICS code for your requirement, the principal purpose NAICS code, is not part of OASIS Plus, then it's going to be outside the scope of the contract program as well. That's why it's important to understand what your requirement scope really is. In terms of the domain, so once you've figured out that, okay, my requirement is not for personal services, it's not for A&E work, it seems like it's going to be a fit for OASIS Plus, now where do I start looking? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have the phase 1, 8 domains that you see here. Each of those domains consists of a set of NAICS codes, and those are different for each domain. And you'll see the number there of how many NAICS codes are part of each domain. So you've taken a look at your requirement. You're pretty sure your requirement, principal purpose requirement, is defined by NAICS code 541330 for engineering services. If that's the case, then you'll want to look and see which of these domains includes that NAICS codes. There are more than one. I'll give you a hint right now. It's not just tech and engineering. But the domains, as I mentioned earlier, were designed to include industry partners that provide similar services. So you should have engineering firms competing against engineering firms. The task orders are going to be limited to the NAICS codes that are in those domains. So you may have 541330, and you may think, well, it's got to be in tech and engineering, but we run an R&D shop. So maybe, but I need engineering services. And I'll show you how that works in a second here. So each of these domains does include, as I mentioned before, several different NAICS codes. Now I'll go through the domains at a high level, but then we'll actually take a look at the lists of NAICS codes for each domain. So the 8 domains that we are establishing under phase 1, as I mentioned, most of these are for services that are currently being done under programs like OASIS or BMO, although some of them represent new work. But for example, the management and advisory services domain, these are kind of the catch-all general management consulting, administrative management type of work that complements an agency's mission and ensures that you can actually meet your objectives and goals. Also provide operating advice and assistance to administrative or management issues like policy, et cetera, business improvement, that kind of thing. Tech and engineering, I've used that as an example several times already, but as you can imagine, it's for really those technical and engineering types of requirements. I need engineers, I need geologists, I need technicians that understand really complicated equipment to do work there, and that's what that domain is designed for. R&D, as you can imagine, is for research and development primarily. This could include your basic research, applied research, experimental development. I need some shiny new stuff kind of work. And that's what that domain is primarily designed for. Logistics, as you can imagine, we're going to plan and then design and then implement the movement of people, places, et cetera, or things and equipment to different locations. That all falls under logistics services. Intelligence, excuse me, this is that new space but it tries to capture firms that understand and have mission experience in the field of C3, C4, or C5 ISR. That's command control communications. Also computers and cyber, depending on which agency you are. I've seen that as well. But then intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Any type of work that needs to be involved with those mission spaces could probably be found, if it's a service, can probably be found under the intelligence domain, as long as it's not principal purpose IT, unless it meets that exception. And then facilities, as you can imagine, this is the management of facilities, but not just one or two buildings. Keep in mind, this is really for large installations, hospitals, cemeteries, etc. Also for the infrastructure of those installations, not just a particular building or one particular facility. Environmental, this is a fairly new area, whereas before environmental consulting or environmental engineering could have been done under something like OASIS, we now have included more of that tangible work for environmental requirements such as remediation and hazardous waste, transportation, removal, disposal, et cetera. And then lastly, the enterprise solutions one for those really large dollar, wide-reaching, highly complex work. That is the last domain under phase one. So hopefully, by the brief descriptions, you've kind of figured out, all right, I know my requirements. Does it seem like it would fit one of those domains? If you're still not sure, then it's a good time to take a look at the details of each of the domains. So as I mentioned before, the management advisory domain, it has 8 different NAICS codes you can see there. Most of the work we can imagine will probably be done under something like 541-611. That's administrative management, general management consulting services. And some examples of the type of work that we typically would see under this domain are things like acquisition and grants management support, or business process improvement, or policy analysis. But you'll notice there are other NAICS codes here besides just 541-611. That's because we understand that there are oftentimes some overlap between requirements and mission spaces. So what you want and need the contractor to do isn't necessarily exactly what the mission is, but it makes sense within a mission space, whether or not you choose one domain over another. This is probably not the best example, but some of the other domains I think represent a better example of this, and I'll talk about that. But these are the 8 NAICS codes for the management advisory domain. Tech and engineering has double the amount of NAICS codes that are involved, but that also includes the engineering NAICS codes like 541-330 and the exceptions. So military aerospace equipment, military weapons, marine engineering, naval architecture, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned earlier, other services that are often closely related, such as testing labs, surveying, and mapping. One thing that you'll notice was both in the M&A domain and also in the technical and engineering domain, there is the 541-611. There's also 541-990 and 541-690. These are some kind of common catch-all NAICS codes that are often used because it's very hard to define what the contractor is actually doing under a different NAICS code, but it applies to a particular mission space. Another thing that you'll see under here is flight training under the tech and engineering services domain. It's a very technical field, so we didn't feel that it was suited for necessarily the human capital domain, which includes most training services. But because it's such a technical training in nature, we included it under this domain. Some example types of services you might find under this domain are things like configuration management, all sorts of engineering from aeronautical to chemical to mechanical, system verification and validation, all those types of services that you would expect to find that technical and engineering firms that can provide. R&D includes 16 other NAICS codes. Obviously, the R&D NAICS codes like 541-715 or 541-714. Also, all those exceptions as well. Excuse me. Once again, you'll see 541-990 and 541-611. So the reason why that we did this is because, as I mentioned, let's say you're NASA and you're running an R&D program to develop new space technology, new space exploration technology. How do we get to Mars and back? You're running an R&D shop. Your mission is in the R&D space. But what you really need is you need a contractor to come in and provide some management advice to your R&D shop. You know, how can we improve this? Or perhaps you want them to look at policy and say, what's wrong with the policy? Where are the gaps? Or maybe you need someone to come in and provide some actual acquisition expertise. You need to acquire a lot of services or products, and you need some contract support. You have the COs, but you don't really have enough possible people with that CS or CO experience to help formulate new requirements or do market research, that type of work. But you need those contractors that understand an R&D program. They need to be able to talk to scientists that are doing research and development. So that's why you'll see this overlap of NAICS codes within these different domains. Yes, what I really need is in the 541611 space. I need them to come in and provide policy analysis of how we're running research and development programs, but that means they have to understand research and development programs. So in those cases, it might make sense to use the NAICS code like 541611, but use it in the research and development services domain. So some examples of R&D work, of course, there's all the new stuff, still lots of new methods of drug delivery, see new manufacturing techniques, new applications for existing products, all sorts of new stuff goes into R&D, but also that ancillary or supportive work, I shouldn't say ancillary, supporting work that goes into doing research and development programs, concept design and modification, prototyping, cell and tissue culture and engineering. So a lot of new and experimental work is typically found under the R&D services domain. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, it can also be work that's not necessarily the R&D work itself, but it's very much supportive, and agency or contractors need to understand R&D programs. Logistics, I won't go into all the details here, but you will find some common ones like 541614 for logistics consulting services, but also the hands-on logistics work of general warehousing and storage, or automotive repair and maintenance, and aircraft repair and maintenance, making sure that the equipment needed to move people and things to different places is operational and ready to go at a moment's notice if I need it. Some examples of that, of course, are deployment logistics. How do we move things quickly to places that need it? How do we manage our inventory correctly? How do we manage the supply chain and make sure that the supply chain will be ready and able to connect us to the products we need when we need them, as well as logistical studies and evaluation. So this really runs a gamut from more the blue collar type work of moving things in trucks or planes to the overarching look at a logistics program. How are we doing things? How can we do things better? That type of analysis as well. The intelligence services domain, as I mentioned, this is a new one for us, but it could involve anything from the engineering of intelligence equipment and technology to the consulting about how do you run intelligence programs, to research and development into new ways of collecting intelligence data, as well as even investigation services. So more of the human intelligence. We're going to take a look at individuals and try to get some data based off of their responses to things or how they're acting. That kind of human intelligence can be done here as well. So this runs a pretty wide gamut of services as well. Some of it more the tangible engineering space, but some of it more data analysis, crunching type of work, looking for trends, and that type of work can be done under the intelligence services domain. Some examples of that include, your counterintelligence work, cyberspace work as well, any investigative surveillance and reconnaissance and targeting developments that you might have more on the equipment side of things, but also mission command planning and application, open source intelligence type of work, signals intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So if your requirement seems to fit into any of these types of examples, then oftentimes that domain might be the good spot to look. Environmental services, as I mentioned, this is now more than just environmental consulting and engineering. It also has more of the tangible work of hazardous waste collection, treatment, disposal, and remediation, which was not previously done on something like OASIS. This could include things from archaeological cultural resource management plans, setting those up, emissions reduction strategy and analyses, hazardous material management, as I mentioned before, water conservation or pollution prevention. This includes things like work on PFAS and PFOA. How do we clean that up, or how do we avoid it getting into our water systems, that type of work. And then, of course, all the other supporting work that could be mapping, cartography, the terrestrial measuring, so LiDAR type of work can be done, remote sensing. This also includes, though, climate change studies, that large level, how does the Air Force affect climate change? That's a large level study that could be conducted under something like this, and we have contractors that are capable of doing that. So lots of different areas now that we've expanded the scope of environmental services. Facility services is huge because there are lots of types of service that can be included in the operation of a base or an installation or a campus, whether it's an educational campus or a hospital campus. So everything from your roofing contractors to electricians to building inspection services to actual engineering services, also to solid waste collection. How do we get rid of trash at our facility? This also includes other support for moving things and making sure that movement equipment is up to date. So road transportation, air transportation, and those other support activities for those types of things. Pest control, janitorial services. We did want to expand this a bit from what BMO previously did so that, well, BMO could be used for maintaining something like a hospital campus. It was more focused on basically the management and operation of particular buildings, whereas we really wanted this to be able to provide support for an entire base, for an entire campus. So that's why you'll see a pretty extensive list of NAICS codes here and the types of services that you might find under the facility services domain, including those base operations support services, but also custodial services, fire alarm system maintenance and repair, but also real property management. Maybe I don't need someone to do the hands-on work. I already have contractors doing the janitorial contracts, but I need someone to help me just manage real property or do assessments on real property, that type of work. So a pretty long list of stuff that could be done under the facility services domain that support those overall base operation requirements. And lastly, the enterprise solutions domain. As I mentioned before, it's fairly unique, and it includes an interesting gamut of NAICS codes here, including ship building and repairing, R&D NAICS codes, engineering NAICS codes, remediation NAICS codes, because some of those projects are huge and require all sorts of moving parts. The engineering solutions domain does not have an example list, and it's because it's really focused on these large dollar, wide-reaching requirements, meaning that you might have multiple tenants that are involved in this. The scope is very complex. It's not just for engineering, but it's engineering, it's IT, it's R&D, it's administrative and financial management, all tied into one. So these are big overarching requirements. And oftentimes these requirements have multi-layered subcontracting teams, not just one prime and one sub, or maybe even two subs. Maybe it's 12 different subcontractors, and then there are subcontractors. There could be a high touch and high accountability for a lot of these requirements where contractors are actually managing government property, and there needs to be extra care taken for these types of requirements in that respect. The accounting systems are often complex. They might need estimating systems or property accounting systems and invoicing demands. The quality control might have to be very stringent to make sure that there's so many moving parts, but we got to make sure they're all doing the right thing in the right place for the right amounts. And oftentimes these requirements are spread out over multiple locations. They could even require extensive upfront capital, which oftentimes means that small businesses really can't compete for this type of work. Which is why the enterprise solutions domain, it does not have a small business set-aside component. It is only for the unrestricted contractors. So you're not going to see it quite yet because we haven't awarded unrestricted contracts yet, but it will be under the unrestricted contract by itself. The minimum order for task orders under enterprise solutions will be $250 million. That's the total value of the task order. So as you can see, it's going to be for pretty large work. We don't expect a lot of requirements to land there, but we do have some agency partners that we know really need that type of space and that set of industry partners that can compete for complex work like that. Okay, so what else do you need to know? There's the rule of three. As I've mentioned this several times already, but when you're getting ready to order, you'll select one NAICS code within one domain, within one contract family, the rule of three. You can issue your RFIs or your sources sought notices across multiple domains, multiple contracts, and multiple NAICS codes. That's okay. You're just doing market research. But when it comes to issuing the RFP itself, it's 111. One NAICS, one domain, one contract. Do keep in mind that FPDS in G, while it is the next generation of FPDS, still is fairly obsolete and does have some limitations. I know this is supposed to be updated hopefully within a year or two, but I'll cross my fingers. The NAICS code that represents in FPDS will probably be wrong in many cases, but that is why we have a task order solicitation management system to make sure that the NAICS code that you use for your solicitation is accurately recorded and tracked for small business utilization count purposes. So while FPDS will say one thing, like it just does for MAS orders today, or even OASIS orders today, it will not affect the OCO's ability to receive small business credit if they're applying or if they are using small business contractors. In terms of selecting labor categories and pricing, I mentioned there are some standard labor categories. There's only 20 different standard labor categories for OASIS Plus. You do not have to use them. You can if you want, but you can also use any contractor labor categories that the contractor develops and defines, or you can have defined labor categories and then evaluate a contractor's proposal to see if their proposal matches what you're expecting to see for specific labor categories. Or you can use a mix of those. While we do have those standardized labor categories, they are limited in nature, and there are only 20 of them. Of those 20, we did negotiate ceiling rates. As I mentioned before, those only apply to those sole source T&M and labor hour orders, or when you know adequate price competition is not going to exist. And as I mentioned before, those ceiling rates are artificially high in many cases because therefore the most experienced contractor employee in the most expensive CONUS location performing on very high risk or very high complex requirements. So in most cases, that ceiling rate probably is not going to be considered fair and reasonable for your particular requirement. There are some exclusions when you would not refer to those ceiling rates, and that is if the work is going to be done in OCONUS locations, or if it's going to be on secret or top secret classified type of work. In those cases, the ceiling rates do not apply. In other cases, though, the proposed rates should not exceed those ceiling rates. Keep in mind, this only applies to those sole source T&M and labor hour orders. Lastly, one note on rates is that SCLS or Davis-Bacon wages are not included at the IDIQ level. If you do need those types of labor categories at the task order level, you will need to make sure that you do the wage determinations for the specific, either the SCLS location or Davis-Bacon location at the task order level. Period of performance isn't something you should have to worry about right away. However, we have had agencies ask about doing a 15-year task order. And so they are considering it already. As I mentioned before, these contracts will be issued with a 5-year base period and a 5-year option period. And after that, a task order period of performance can continue for up to 66 months past the ordering period expiration of OASIS Plus. If you build in a -8 extension and you include all the available options for up to 5 years. So as long as those task orders are issued prior to the expiration of the OASIS Plus IDIQ contracts, so it's 2024 right now. If we make awards in 2025, well, let's say we made awards today on October 1st, 2024, and you issued a task order today, that potentially could go all the way to October 1st. No, not October 1st, I take that back. If we add an additional 6 months to that, March 1st of 2040, potentially. Now, would you really be able to do that? Probably not. But keep in mind, there is going to be a limitation on how long task orders can go, but they can extend up to 5 years and 6 months past that. Keep in mind, if you do get to that point, especially if you're getting 8A credit for something, double check with the SBA to make sure that the contractors are still eligible for credit if you're going to exercise those options or extensions. They may have something different to say about that. So putting this all together, first of all, acquisition planning is very important. Do your market research to make sure that OASIS Plus is going to be a right fit for you. That means taking advantage of scope reviews and the MRAS program if necessary. Would research those contract features, make sure that the domains in OASIS Plus make sense for your requirement. Should I set this aside for one of those contract socioeconomic programs or the small business program? Does the period of performance, will that affect whether or not I can issue an award under this? Or do I need to issue in a BPA? And should I look at something else because I can't do that under OASIS Plus? So as I mentioned, look for those scope review opportunities. Do your market research, the MRAS program, if it makes sense. Find out whether or not other agencies have used OASIS Plus for the same or similar type of work in the past. There are a lot of tools that allow you to do that. And as we finally see orders placed under OASIS Plus, then you'll see what other agencies have successfully done. You can take a look at what agencies have done under OASIS, HCATS, or PMO today. Make sure that if you're going to be the OCO, that you get your Delegation of Procurement Authority and that you've taken training like this. Or if you know an OCO that isn't on today's training, let them know that they will have to get their DPA. Keep in mind that if they did have a DPA under Legacy OASIS, it does not carry over to OASIS Plus. So if you're a CO today, or you know a CO today that has an OASIS DPA, let them know they'll have to they'll have to take the new OASIS Plus DPA training and get a new OASIS Plus DPA. Once you've done all that, you're ready to actually issue your solicitation. Then you can do that, review the solicitation procedures in the ordering guide, release it through GSA eBuy, award that task order using, of course, the evaluation factors and source selection procedures that you said you would use in your solicitation, especially if it's going to be over 10 million, where there's more of a risk of protest, and then manage that task order throughout its life, including closing it out. Okay, we do have to talk about the contract access fee, and I have 15 minutes left, so I'll try to be quick. So there is a fee associated with using a program like OASIS Plus, because you do have to pay for all of our contracting staff that continues to administer these IDIQ contracts at the level, the systems that we maintain to allow you to issue task orders and gain information through things like our OASIS Plus website, the continued training that folks like my team does, and scope reviews and market research that we help with. That fee is 0.15%. That's called the contract access fee, or CAF is how we often call it. It is a non-negotiable flat rate fee that we're applying to everybody that uses the OASIS Plus program. We're not negotiating separate MOAs or MOUs for different CAF rates. We did do that under some other programs, and it became pretty convoluted and complex, and errors were sometimes made. So we're trying to avoid that, make it pretty simple. The CAF does have to be applied on every task order, and it has to be included as a separate task order CLIN under the master terms and conditions of the contract. So make sure you keep that as a separate CLIN, and it does apply to the entire task order. It needs to be on every task order. But as I mentioned, it is 0.15%. That is lower than almost any other rate that you'll see out there, except for Legacy OASIS today and in some exceptions. The traditional rate for a lot of other programs has typically been around closer to 0.75%. So this is quite a drop from that. In terms of what you have to do and the mechanics of including the CAF, you'll want to make sure that it's included on every line item as a separate line item for every invoice. The OASIS Plus contractors must be reporting that on all the task orders that they remit back to us. That's how we do get paid, is you pay the contractor, then they pay it back to us. And then we verify that the amounts that they are being paid are the amounts that they should have had based on the initial award information that you provide to us. So for each invoice, we recommend this. We also recommend that you include the CAF fee as a flexible type of CLIN, not necessarily a fixed price CLIN if you can avoid that. The reason being is because if for some reason, if you have a fixed price order and a fixed price CLIN, and you end up changing that, then you have to modify that CAF CLIN as well. And especially if that's already been paid, that can create a sticky situation because if the CAF has been paid to the contractor, the contractor's paid us, and then there's a modification that cuts services for some reason or stops services, then it takes a lot of legwork to then go through those steps to fix what was overpaid. So since we're all human and we all make mistakes, and even though we try to avoid as much as that as possible using automated systems, it still can happen. So what do you do if a contractor doesn't include the CAF in a proposal? Well, it's pretty easy. If they omitted it from the proposal, but you haven't accepted the proposal yet, then you just go back and notify them that they have to update their proposal to include the CAF so that you can include that as part of your price evaluation. What if it happens if you already accepted it? Well, then the OCO has to notify the contractor that it was omitted, and they must consider a modification even if they have accepted it already. to reevaluate that. It would be something like a clarification, and that's something in that case. If the CAF hasn't been included in a request for payment, so the award's been issued, now it's coming down to invoicing time. As long as the request for payment has not yet been accepted, just make sure you let them know. They can modify the request for payment, include that CAF, and then get it paid. Now, if it was already accepted, obviously make sure you let them know so that they don't do it again. But then you will have to figure out some sort of corrective action to make sure that the CAF that was missed does get paid appropriately on a future invoice. If you ever need help with any of that, please do let us know. You can email the OASIS Plus GSA team. We can try to help with that as much as possible. Okay, task order management. I said I would cover eBuy at a high level because we don't have all the details about it quite yet, and we will have separate trainings on it. But do keep in mind, GSA eBuy is going to be the task order solicitation system that you will be using for OASIS Plus. It's a mandatory task order solicitation system. It is not writing your task orders for you. It's not a contract writing system. It is just a way of making sure that your solicitation, your request for proposal, gets out to the appropriate fair opportunity pool of OASIS Plus contractors, and it allows you to intake those proposals and issue announcements for awards and non-awards for those task orders. But it's not writing anything in terms to your contracts themselves. You have your own contract writing systems for that. It's not writing out a task order. It's just managing the solicitation. So I do want to clarify that because some folks kind of conflate the two. But the nice thing is that eBuy has been around quite a long time. It is being modified specifically for OASIS Plus use, and it will be available for all 6 of our IDIQ contracts programs, of course. But if you're already familiar with the schedules program, you're probably already using eBuy. So hopefully it's nothing new to you. You don't have to learn a new system, which is one of the nice things. But we are making it mandatory, as I mentioned, because fair opportunity is of particular concern for a program like OASIS Plus. Because it is based off of FAR 16505 ordering procedures, we need to make sure that it makes it to the appropriate contractors that hold the right CLIN under the right domain under the right IDIQ contract. That rule of 3, as I mentioned earlier. That is your fair opportunity pool. And that can change, especially if contractors outgrow particular business sizes or socioeconomic designations. So registered DPA trainees, you'll get eBuy instructions before we actually open the floodgates for awards and notices to proceed. And like I mentioned, we will offer some training sessions specifically for eBuy and OASIS Plus. So be on the lookout for that. That's what BOLO stands for, if you're not aware. For training dates and registrations, we will post those under the OASIS Plus website. So we do have some screenshots of what this is going to look like. And if, like I mentioned, if you're already familiar with eBuy, then this won't look a whole lot different. But once you access eBuy, do a search for OASIS Plus. All the different contract programs will show up there. You can select the contract programs that you're interested in using. And within each of those contract programs, you can select the different NAICS codes under a domain that you're interested in pursuing as well. Now, keep in mind, if you're doing an RFI, you can select multiples. You can send it out to different contract programs, as well as domains, as well as NAICS codes. But if you are issuing an RFP, it's 1, 1, and 1. So if we're doing an RFP, then once you select that particular NAICS code within a particular domain, you'll get the list of all contractors that qualified for that NAICS code within that domain. And that's who you will send your RFP to. If you're using an exception to fair opportunity, of course, that's different. Then you won't be sending it to everybody. There are different rules about that. But this is how eBuy will be set up for you. Once you've done that, you can issue the basics about your requirement, including a title, the reference number if you have one, the description, etc. Upload your documents, of course, your PWS, the RFP instructions, how you're going to evaluate proposals, how you're going to select an awardee, etc., and then the contact information for who's going to be accepting all of that, those lucky people. Then once you've sent out your RFP, then you'll have basically an active way of managing responses. You'll see who is you can manage your RFPs if you're doing several at once. You can also then look at who has responded back to those RFPs, whether or not it's still open, how long it's going to remain open, et cetera, et cetera. You can also take a look at contractor specifics. Over there on the right-hand side, there's an example for exponential value partners, and take a look at that particular contract, especially in the market research phase. That might be a little bit more helpful for you. So as we continue, the quote responses, so this is on the contractor side of it. If you have to update RFPs, you can do that as well. We are asking if eBuy can change that from RFQ to RFP for OASIS Plus, because obviously these aren't requests for quotes, these are requests for proposals. But these are just screenshots, and hopefully they kind of give you an idea. But as I mentioned, we will be issuing separate training just for this. There are some links here on a basic training right now. So if you're not familiar with eBuy, you can actually access training today and get familiar with eBuy and eBuy Open, which is a fantastic resource. There's also the eBuy Buyer Job Aid, which I think is actually a really well put together document that can walk folks through eBuy and how to use it. And then, of course, there's the link to the website as well. As I mentioned, eBuy Open, this is actually for government employees only that have a max.gov registration. This allows you as a government representative to actually take a look at any RFQs, RFPs that have been posted to eBuy, and hopefully provide you a way of looking at other similar requirements that may have gone out to programs like OASIS Plus, or even the Schedules program, or anything else that uses eBuy for that matter. So it's a great research tool that you also have available to you. So what's next? All right, you've sat through an hour and a half of me talking, and you're ready to get your DPA if you're a CO. So if you are a warranted CO, you're going to be issuing orders under OASIS Plus. We already have the request form set up online at the OASIS Plus website. You can scan that QR code there in the upper right-hand corner, or you can just go to the links that we provide there for getting your DPA. And that's right there at the top. You'll have to fill out some basic information about it, supply your warrant number and your DPA completion certificate, which you should be getting about 7 to 10 business days, and then email that information to oasisplusdpa@gsa.gov. If for some reason you don't have a .gov or .mil address, just email oasisplusdpa@gsa.gov with all the information, and we'll get you set up with a DPA that way as well. And like I mentioned before, if you have your legacy OASIS DPA, it does not carry over to OASIS Plus. So you'll need to request a new one after completing this training. Additional resources, as I mentioned before, we're going to leave this presentation. We're going to send this out to all of the attendees today. So you will be able to click on the links in this presentation and go to these different websites. But a few of them that I do want to highlight, obviously the OASIS Plus website, we're continuing to update that as changes are made. As we make large announcements, we are posting them there on the website, as well as other places like the Interact community blog. But there are some resources that we've already built in, including the online ordering guide. There's the OASIS Plus fact sheet, if you just need a quick dirty of what's going on with OASIS Plus. A link to requesting a scope review is available. Market research as a service, I mentioned this a couple times already. Very helpful RFI tool, free for agencies to use, and something that industry tends to be a lot more responsive to than your typical RFIs. We're incorporating OASIS Plus already into MRAS. So if you're used to using it for other contract programs, you will be able to use it for OASIS Plus as well once we've made awards for OASIS Plus. In the meantime, they have no one to send it out to because there's not actually any awards that are in our system yet, but they will be soon. Calc Plus, if you are running into problems formulating an IGCE, or if you're looking at some extra tools to help you beef up your pricing fair and reasonable determination, Calc Plus Pricing Intelligence Suite is a fantastic tool there. They have not only the schedules awarded labor rates, they also have transactional data, that's prices paid data from programs like OASIS and our IT GWACs. There's also the BLS data, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, that you can use to build up an estimate based on direct labor rates. It doesn't include the indirects, but you can estimate those based on the contract type that you're looking at, et cetera. There's also the link to the scope reviews, as I mentioned. Actually, that's on there twice. So we want to really make sure you get a scope review done. And then also links on how to obtain a DPA. So if you know somebody that didn't attend today's training, or you need a reminder if you're not a warranted CO today, but you become one in the future and you need to get your DPA, you don't have to retake the training. You just have to request your DPA at that point. So some resources for you. And then lastly, PSHC not only manages the OASIS Plus program, but we manage a bunch of other programs as well, including the Legacy OASIS, the HCATS programs, which we've mentioned today, portions of the Schedules program, which I've also mentioned today. But we also manage Smart Pay, the CSAW program, we have the Direct Client Support program, and then a lot of these tools as well, including the Calc Plus Pricing Intelligence Suite that I just mentioned, the Steps to Performance-Based Acquisition, currently Symphony Procurement Suite, which can be used for OASIS, but not for OASIS Plus. So if you ever have any other questions about any of the other programs, please let us know. You can email either professionalservices@gsa.gov, or if you email something like OASIS Plus, gsa.gov, we'll get to you that way as well. So it is 11:30 my time, I guess 2:30 now on the East Coast time. But hopefully I covered all the information that you need to know about OASIS Plus, because this is the end. And hopefully all the questions got answered through the Q&A pod. It looks like there are 25 questions answered. So thank you to the team that's been answering those. While we still have a moment, were there any questions that really stood out that we need to address for the entire audience?
I don't think so, Brian. I think we were able to answer them completely.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, if you do need more information, though, once again, there's the QR code for the OASIS Plus website, and some other links there to other ways of getting information. You can always email us, though, at oasisplus@gsa.gov. So thank you all very much for attending today on the very first day of the new fiscal year. Hopefully you all have a wonderful Halloween, and don't ghost your friends. Just don't do it. All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.